In the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the New Mexico territory, the land itself was a scripture of violence, its harsh commandments written in dust and stone. It was a place that broke men as easily as it broke horses, a crucible where souls were either forged into something hard as steel or burned away to ash. Into this unforgiving world, two histories, both written in fire and blood, were destined to collide. One belonged to Jacob Thorne, a rancher living in the quiet ruins of his own life, a man so haunted by the ghosts of his past that he had forgotten the feeling of the sun on his face. The other belonged to Naiya, a young Apache woman who had been stripped of her people, her name, and her future, a final, defiant ember of a fire that a hidden evil had tried to extinguish. Their story did not begin with a glance or a word, but with an act of desperate, reckless mercy at the foot of a dead cottonwood tree, under the shadow of a hateful sign that declared war on compassion itself. Jacob's decision to cut her down was not just the saving of a life. It was the first shot fired in a battle against a shared destiny neither of them knew they had. This is not merely a tale of survival, but of the brutal, beautiful alchemy of two broken souls forging a weapon from their shared pain. It is a story that asks if a path to redemption can be paved with the stones of vengeance, and if love, in its purest and most primal form, can bloom in the barren soil of two graves. Part 1. Echoes and Embers. The sun over the New Mexico territory was not a life-giver, but a tyrant. It hammered the cracked earth with a relentless, white-hot fist, demanding submission from every living thing. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue, and baked the silence into the very stones, creating a landscape that felt as ancient and unforgiving as a skull. In this land of shimmering heat and long, skeletal shadows, Jacob Thorne moved like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. He was mending a stretch of fence line, his movements practiced and heavy, each monotonous rap of the hammer a hollow beat in the vast, indifferent emptiness. The fence itself was a fool's errand, a flimsy suggestion of order against a wilderness that respected none. His ranch was a portrait of slow surrender. The barn sagged, its timber groaning a constant complaint in the dry wind, its stalls far emptier than they ought to be. Near the porch, a swing set, built for two, hung lopsided. One seat was gone entirely, the other dangled from a single rusted chain like a hanged man, swaying gently in a breeze that carried no relief. This was not a home, it was a place where memories had come to fester and die. Inside the relative cool of the cabin, the air was thick with years of unspoken words. Jacob poured a ladle of water from a wooden bucket, the splash echoing with startling clarity. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, drifted to a series of notches carved into a doorframe. Faded pencil marks, a testament to a child's growth, climbed the wood, culminating in a final, darker line next to the ghost of a name. Abigail. He froze for a long second, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the ladle. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, ambushed him, not a full picture, but a sensory ghost. The phantom weight of a small hand in his, the echo of a laugh that the wind had long since stolen. A muscle in his jaw clenched, a small, hard knot of grief that never truly dissolved. Then the moment passed, buried once more beneath the calloused exterior of a man who had taught himself that feeling was a liability. He drank the water in 3 long swallows, the coolness doing nothing to quench the fire in his gut, and stepped back out into the punishing light. Work was the only prayer he had left, and it was a prayer that was never answered. He was tracking a stray calf, its prints a faint, wandering trail in the dust, when he first heard it. The sound was so thin, so alien in the natural symphony of the desert, that he thought it a trick of the heat. The silence out here was a living thing, composed of the drone of cicadas, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. But this was different. It was a whimper, a thread of human suffering carried on the air. Jacob reined in his horse, Pilgrim, his body instantly shedding its weariness and becoming a study in tense alertness. He slid from the saddle, his movements economical and silent, his hand resting on the worn walnut stock of the rifle sheathed beside his leg. He moved forward on foot, his boots sinking into the fine red dust, his eyes scanning the jumble of rocks and thorny junipers. The sound vanished, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then it came again, closer this time, a pained exhalation that spoke of an agony beyond words. He pushed aside a curtain of dry, brittle branches and stepped into a small, sun-drenched clearing. And there he saw her. The sight hit him not like a sound, but like a physical blow to the chest. She was hanging from the lowest branch of a dead cottonwood, her arms stretched taut above her head, her body as limp as a discarded doll. Her feet, bare and bloody, skimmed the dirt. Dust and dried sweat caked her dark skin, and her black hair was a tangled mat across her face. A shallow, erratic flutter in her chest was the only sign she was still among the living. But it was the object nailed to the tree above her head that made Jacob's blood run cold. A crude plank of wood, smeared with angry red paint, bearing a jagged, hateful inscription. "White man, don't forgive." The words screamed into the silence, a declaration of a war that never ended. Bile rose in his throat. This wasn't just a killing, it was a sermon. A message left to rot in the sun for all to see. He took an involuntary step back, his mind reeling. A voice, cold and practical, whispered in his head, "Ride away. This is not your fight. This is the devil's work, and you invite him home at your peril." He saw the logic in it. He had nothing left to give, nothing left to lose except the bitter peace of his solitude. But then the girl stirred, a low moan escaping her cracked lips. And that sound, that fragile testament to a life not yet extinguished, ignited another voice in his soul, one he thought had died with Abigail. It was the voice of the man who had stood frozen while his world burned. His gaze fell to the rawhide ropes cutting into her wrists, and the memory of his sister's last moments washed over him with the force of a flash flood. He would not be that man again. Not today. He looked from the girl to the hateful sign and back again. Was he the man on that sign? The man who doesn't forgive? Or was he something else? To hell with all of them, he rasped, the words a gravelly tear in the silence, a curse aimed at the sign, at the men who wrote it, at the world that allowed it. The blade of his knife was sharp. With one swift, upward slice, the rope parted. She fell forward, and he caught her, surprised by how light she was, as if the suffering had burned everything solid out of her. She felt like a child in his arms, feverish and frail. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, deep pools of terror and confusion, not quite focusing on him. He eased her to the ground, pulling a canteen from his belt. He wet a cloth and gently dabbed her lips, whispering words he wasn't sure she could hear. "Easy now. You're safe." Evans. He carried her back to the ranch, a strange, weightless burden. The setting sun cast their single, merged shadow long and distorted behind them. Inside, he laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the cabin. In the flickering lamplight, he saw the full, brutal scripture of her pain, He worked in silence, his movements gentle as he bathed the dust and blood from her skin. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor, were surprisingly tender as he cleaned her wounds. She did not flinch, did not make a sound. She simply watched him, her dark eyes following his every move, a wild and wary animal cornered in a strange den. The silence between them was a heavy blanket. He knew no words that could bridge the chasm of race, of violence, of fear that separated them. So he gave her the only thing he could. "The name's Jacob," he said, his voice rough. He looked at her still, silent form, at this human being stripped of everything, even a name. "Reckon I've got to call you something. Elara. I'll call you Elara." It felt right. A name for the living. He placed a bowl of thin stew and a cup of water by the cot. He grabbed his bedroll, his shadow looming large on the cabin walls. He would sleep in the barn, give her the illusion of safety. He was exhausted, his body aching, his soul scraped raw. He paused at the door, his hand on the rough-hewn wood, ready to retreat back into the familiar solitude of the night. There. Coming. The voice was a dry, cracked whisper, but it cut through the night with the clarity of a breaking window. Jacob froze, his entire body rigid. He turned back slowly, his heart pounding a sudden, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The girl, Elara, had pushed herself up slightly on one elbow. Her eyes were no longer vacant. They were sharp, focused, and gleaming with a terrifying lucidity in the dim light. In that gaze, he saw not a broken victim, but a survivor, a sentinel. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that in cutting her down from that tree, he had not just saved a life. He had invited the storm to his door. Part 2. The Devil's Long Shadow. Jacob's reaction to her words was instantaneous, a reflex forged by years of living on the edge of oblivion. He didn't startle, he simply became a part of the shadows, melting back from the doorway and grabbing the rifle that was always leaning against the wall. The heavy, familiar weight of the weapon was a cold comfort in his hands. He moved to the side of the cot, his voice a low, urgent whisper that demanded answers. Who's coming?" Elara's eyes were wide, the fire in them already starting to fade, consumed by the immense effort it took to speak. She tried to push herself up again, a name struggling on her lips, but a wave of exhaustion, deep and profound, pulled her back under. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and her breathing, though still steady, deepened into the rhythm of a hard-won sleep. She had delivered her warning, and the toll had been too great. He was alone again, with a rifle in his hand and a single, terrifying question echoing in the silent cabin. Who were they? The night passed with the agonizing slowness of a watched pot that never boils. Jacob did not sleep. He sat on the porch in a worn wooden chair, the rifle laid across his lap, his gaze fixed on the silvered plains. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every shifting shadow in the moonlight looked like a rider. But the night offered no threat, only a suffocating suspense. The horizon remained empty. The silence was absolute. He was used to facing tangible dangers, but this waiting, this utter blindness to the nature of the enemy, gnawed at him. He was protecting a stranger from a phantom, and in doing so, had made his isolated ranch the center of a map he couldn't read. In those tense hours, the memory of Abigail returned, not as a vague sadness, but as the cold, sharp feeling of helplessness he'd felt hearing the screams from the barn and doing nothing. Tonight, he would not be helpless. He would be the wall. When dawn finally broke, nothing had changed. The world was exactly as it had been, yet entirely different. The air inside the cabin was thick with a new kind of tension. Jacob moved with a quiet purpose, stoking the fire, making coffee. He glanced at Alara. She was awake, propped against the wall, watching him with an unnerving stillness. The vulnerability of the previous day was still there, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, intelligent caution. He brought her a plate with a piece of cornbread and dried jerky, setting it down without a word. This time, she didn't hesitate. She ate, slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was an act of defiance. When their eyes met, he no longer saw just a victim. He saw a will of iron that had refused to be extinguished. To break the silence, he began to talk, his voice a low rumble, not expecting a reply. "My horse's name is Pilgrim. Old Beast is more stubborn than a rock, but he's loyal." He spoke of the creaking windmill, of the creek that had run dry. He did not speak of Abigail, did not speak of the ghosts, but by filling the space with the mundane, he was trying to build a bridge. The sound of a lone horse arrived just before noon. It was not the stealthy approach of an outlaw, but the steady, confident gait of someone who believed he had a right to be there. Jacob's hand went to the pistol tucked in his belt as he stepped onto the porch. A soldier, wearing the dusty blue of the cavalry, reined in his horse. He was young, with a sunburnt face and the weary eyes of a man who had ridden too long on a thankless errand. "Afternoon," the soldier said. "This the Thorne residence?" Jacob gave a curt nod. "Depends who's asking." The man dismounted. "Lieutenant Wallace. My patrol is tracking a fugitive. An Apache girl." Sevens. Jacob's blood ran cold, but his expression didn't flicker. Inside, he could almost hear the way Alara's breathing must have stopped. The lieutenant pulled a folded, sweat-stained paper from his tunic. He unfolded it to reveal a crudely drawn sketch of a young woman with sharp eyes and long, dark hair. Below it, the words were stark. "Wanted for murder of a homesteader. Considered armed and dangerous. $50 reward. $50. The price of a good horse, or the cost of a man's soul. You seen anyone matching this description?" Wallace asked, his eyes scanning the property, lingering for a moment too long on the cabin's closed door. This was it. The moment of choice. He could end it all right here. Tell the truth, collect the money, and let the storm pass over someone else's land. He thought of the rope burns on her wrists, the terror in her eyes, the simple, desperate warning she had given him with her last ounce of strength. He looked the lieutenant dead in the eye. "Can't say I have," Jacob said, his voice level and calm. "Been quiet out here for weeks. Ain't seen a soul but my own reflection, and I'm getting tired of him." The lie came easier than he expected. It felt less like a choice, and more like the only path his feet could still walk. Lieutenant Wallace's gaze narrowed. "You sure about that, Mr. Thorne? She's a slippery one. We have reason to believe she's wounded. Someone might have taken her in." The officer's hand rested casually on the flap of his holster, a subtle reminder of his authority. "She's not just some runaway," Wallace pressed. "She's a killer. Harboring a fugitive is a federal offense." Jacob didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. "I hear you, Lieutenant. If I see anything, I'll ride into town myself." After another long, searching look, Wallace seemed to accept it, or at least accept that he could get no more. He mounted his horse. "See that you do," he said, before turning and riding away. Jacob stood on the porch until the rider was just a speck on the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and strangely alive. He turned and went back inside. Elara stood in the center of the small room, having emerged from whatever corner she had used to hide. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. They stared at each other across the charged space, the unspoken truth of what he had just done hanging between them. He had lied to the law. He had made her fight his own. He had chosen her over the world. He expected fear, or maybe even suspicion. He did not expect what she did next. She walked over to the cot, picked up the empty plate and cup he had given her, and carried them to the small wash basin in the corner. With quiet, deliberate motions, she began to wash them. It was a simple, domestic act, an offer of shared labor in a shared home. It was her answer. It was a promise. She was no longer a guest, a patient, or a fugitive he was hiding. She was a partner. And as the sound of her washing the dish filled the small cabin, Jacob knew his life of quiet solitude was over. He hadn't just saved her from the storm, he had stepped into it with her. Part 3. What the Fire Remembered. The days that followed settled into a fragile, unspoken rhythm, a delicate truce with the violent world outside. The immediate threat of Lieutenant Wallace had passed, leaving behind a quiet watchfulness, a shared secret that bound Jacob and Elara together in the silent cabin. Jacob returned to his chores, but his movements were different. He was no longer just a man going through the motions. He was a sentry, his eyes constantly scanning the vast, empty horizon, his ears attuned to any sound that was not the wind or the groan of the windmill. Elara, in turn, began to reclaim herself. Color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted, vacant look in her eyes was replaced by a quiet, fierce intelligence. She moved about the cabin with a newfound purpose, cleaning, mending her tattered clothes with a needle and thread Jacob had wordlessly left for her. Her small acts of domesticity were a defiant statement against the chaos that had nearly consumed her. They spoke little, their communication a language of gestures. A bucket of fresh water he'd leave by the door in the morning would be met with a neatly folded shirt of his, a button sewn back on, left on his cot in the evening. It was a piece as thin as a pane of glass, beautiful in its clarity, but destined to be shattered. The break came on the fourth day. For the first time, Elara stepped out of the cabin on her own, not to flee, but to feel the sun on her skin. She walked to a patch of bare, wind-swept earth near the barn and knelt, her expression unreadable. With a pointed stick, she began to draw in the dirt. Jacob set aside the harness he was mending and walked over, his boots quiet on the ground. He stood a few feet behind her, watching the image take shape. It was a bird, its wings spread wide in mid-flight, but it was wreathed in flames, a phoenix born of agony. He squatted beside her, his voice low. "What is it?" She didn't look up at first, her focus entirely on the drawing, as if the memory was too heavy to carry and look at him at the same time. "It is my people," she said, her voice dry and cracked. "The people of the summer flame. We flew where the sun was warmest." Her finger traced the flames around the bird. Then the whitecoats came. Soldiers. They said the land was theirs. They said we were vermin. Her breath hitched. We did not leave, so they brought the fire to us. Jacob listened, his own ghosts stirring, his jaw tight. They burned the lodges, she continued, her voice thinning to a whisper. They shot everyone. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes dark wells of a pain so profound he felt it in his own chest. Their leader, he was not like the other soldiers. His eyes were empty. He laughed while the fires burned. A sound like stones breaking. And on the back of his right hand, he wore a brand, a coiled snake. Sevens. A coiled snake. The words struck Jacob like a physical blow. The world around him seemed to tilt, the buzzing of the insects fading to a dull roar in his ears. He saw not the girl before him, but a flash of fire against a night sky, heard not her voice, but the phantom echo of a scream. Abigail's scream, sharp and final. He masked the shock, a lifetime of hiding his feelings serving him well. He gave a slow, somber nod. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, the words feeling hollow. He stood up abruptly. I have to check on the horses." He turned and walked to the barn on unsteady legs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air in the barn was thick with the scent of hay and old grief. He knelt before an old, dust-covered chest, his hands trembling as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket, was a worn, leather-bound journal. His father's. With shaking fingers, he flipped through the brittle pages, past entries about rainfall and cattle prices, until he reached the last, spidery script. The entry was dated 6 years prior. It described the raid, the night his world ended. His father had written that the attackers were not Indians. They were white men, disguised to stir up hatred. Jacob's eyes scanned the page, his breath catching in his throat as he read the last lines his father ever wrote. Their captain was a demon in the shape of a man. He moved with military precision. I saw him clearly in the light of our burning home. A tall man, with a laugh like grinding stone, and on the back of his hand, plain as day, was the brand of a coiled snake. Jacob stared at the words, the faded ink screaming a truth his mind refused to accept. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a similar story. It was the same story, the same fire, the same monster. The ghost he had been running from all these years suddenly had a name, a face, and a brand. And his name was Gideon Rourke. Before the cold rage could fully solidify, the sound of an approaching horse pulled him back to the present. He hid the journal and stepped out of the barn, his hand on his pistol. The rider was old, leathery, and sat his horse like he had been born on it. His eyes, pale and sharp, missed nothing. "Howdy," the old man said, his voice like gravel. "Lookin' for a man named Thorne." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "You found him." The man spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Name's Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed. I'm a bounty hunter." Jacob said nothing. "I'm tracking a man," Jed continued, his eyes sweeping over the ranch. "Calls himself Captain Gideon Rourke. Runs a band of ex-Confederate cutthroats. He passed through this territory, left a trail of fire and blood a blind man could follow." Jed's gaze settled back on Jacob, sharp and penetrating. "This place, it has the smell of Rourke's work on it. The kind of ghosts he leaves behind. You know anything about that, Mr. Thorne?" Jacob's face was a mask of stone. He thought of the journal, of the drawing in the dirt. He gave a slow shake of his head. Ghosts are just ghosts. Jed's lips twisted into a humorless smile. Fair enough. Well, here's some free advice. Rourke and his men are heading south, towards the borderlands. They hit a mining payroll 2 days east of here, killed everyone. He's not a ghost, friend. He's a plague. If you aim to stay alive, I suggest you point your horse north. He tipped his hat. There's a fat price on his head. I aim to collect it. With that, Jedediah Stone turned his horse and rode off, a specter of pragmatic violence disappearing into the heat shimmer. He had left behind a whirlwind. Jacob stood frozen, the bounty hunter's words echoing in his head. Heading south. A direction. He was no longer fighting a ghost. He was fighting a man who could be found. He walked back into the cabin. Ilara looked up from the fire, her eyes full of questions as she saw the look on his face. The grief was still there, but it was now forged into something harder, something terrifyingly clear. He walked over to the table and laid his father's open journal upon it, his finger pointing to the last entry. She leaned over, her eyes tracing the faded script, her breath catching as she read the description. Her gaze shot up to meet his, a silent, horrified understanding passing between them in that single, shattering moment. He closed the journal with a quiet snap. The sound seemed to finalize a decision that had been made for him 6 years ago. You said you didn't know where they went, Jacob said, his voice low and hard as granite, devoid of all its earlier weariness. I think I do. Sevens, Part 4. 2. Graves or One Road. The air in the cabin following the revelation was thick and heavy, charged with the energy of 2 histories colliding. The shared horror in Ilara's eyes as she read the journal entry had mirrored Jacob's own, creating a bond forged not in affection, but in the white-hot furnace of a shared grievance. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The ghosts that had haunted them separately now filled the small room together, a silent congregation demanding a reckoning. It was Jacob who broke the silence, his voice raw, stripped of its usual defenses. Her name was Abigail, he said, looking at the floor. She was 16. When Rourke's men came, I was out hunting. I heard the screams from the ridge. I hid. I waited for them to leave. By the time I got back, the house was burning and she was gone. The confession, buried for 6 years, tumbled out of him, a torrent of shame and regret. That fear, it's been my only companion since. I didn't save her. Ilara. No, she was Naiya now, he thought, the name he'd given her a pale imitation of her true self, listened without judgment. When he finished, she reached across the small table and placed her hand over his, her touch a small anchor in his storm of memory. My father was a chief, she said softly, her voice gaining a strength he hadn't heard before. He taught us that a person's spirit is a fire. It can be dimmed, but never extinguished unless hope is lost. Gideon Rourke did not just kill our families, Jacob Thorne. He tried to steal our hope. She looked from the journal to his eyes, her gaze unwavering. He failed. In that moment, they were no longer a white man and an Apache woman, a rescuer and a victim. They were the last embers of 2 fires Rourke had tried to put out, and they were about to burn together. "We do this together," Jacob said, his voice finding a new, hard certainty. "We hunt him down." Naiya gave a single, firm nod. "For Abigail," she whispered, "and for the people of the summer flame." Their pact was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared gaze that promised a bloody end to their story, one way or another. Their grief, now honed into a weapon, demanded a plan. They spent the next hour poring over a dusty map of the territory Jacob owned. Rourke was heading south. Jedediah Stone was on his trail. Their options were limited. They needed ammunition, supplies, and a second horse. The only place to get them was the town of Redemption, a 2-day ride away. A dusty, paranoid settlement that was openly hostile to natives and unwelcoming to strangers. For Naiya to go there was a death sentence. As they debated the risk, a sudden, sharp crack of a twig outside the cabin sent them both into motion. Jacob grabbed his rifle, and Naiya seized a heavy iron poker from the hearth, their movements a synchronized dance of shared peril. They were not fast enough. The cabin door burst open, and a figure moved with a blur of speed, a living shadow. He slammed into Jacob, sending the rifle clattering away, and a follow-up blow to the head sent Jacob sprawling to the floor, his vision exploding in stars. The attacker was an Apache warrior, young, lean, and radiating a coiled, lethal intensity. His face was painted with black and red lines of mourning and war. He ignored Jacob on the floor, his entire focus on Naiya. He spoke to her in a rapid, guttural Apache dialect, his words a mix of command and desperation. Naiya stood her ground, the poker held defensively, her eyes wide with shock. The warrior, seeing the poker, let out a harsh sound of derision. He continued speaking, gesturing at the downed, groaning Jacob with contempt. He was telling her to come with him, that this white man was a cage, that their people's vengeance could not be trusted to an outsider. He was offering her a different path, a purer one. This was Koa. He was the last warrior of the Black Creek people, whose families had also been slaughtered by the man with the snake brand. He had been tracking the last survivor of the summer flame, and he had found her in the den of her enemy. This was the ultimate test. Jacob, struggling to push himself up, his head throbbing, saw the choice laid bare before Naiya. On one side was Koa, a reflection of her own people, offering a clear path of righteous fury. On the other was Jacob, a man of the very race that had destroyed her, an uncertain ally bound to her only by a shared wound. Koa took a step towards her, his hand outstretched. "He will betray you," Koa said in their tongue, his voice dropping to a persuasive hiss. "Their poison always works its way out. Our blood calls for justice. Come with me, sister." For a heart-stopping moment, Naiya hesitated. Her eyes flickered to Jacob, then back to Koa. The pull of her own blood, her own culture, was a powerful tide. But then she looked at Jacob's face, at the pain and determination warring there, and she saw not a white man, but simply a man who had chosen to stand with her when the entire world had cast her out to die. Her decision was swift and absolute. She took a step back from Koa and moved to stand over Jacob, placing herself between the two men. "His ghosts are my ghosts now," she replied in the same dialect, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned both men. "His road is my road. The fire that took his family was the same fire that took ours. We will see the end of this path together, or not at all." Her defiance was unmistakable. Koa stared at her, his expression shifting from anger to a grudging, surprised respect. He saw not a weak, lost girl, but a leader. He lowered his hand. He had lost this battle. But he was a warrior, and a warrior's path was one of pragmatism. "Rourke's trail is cold to the bounty hunter," Koa said, switching to rough, accented English for Jacob's benefit. "But not to us. 2 nights from now, Rourke's men will raid a silver transport moving through the Shadow Canyon. It is their way. They are arrogant." He looked from Jacob to Naiya. "He will not be there, but his right hand will. A man named Calloway." He backed away towards the door. "Do with that what you will. But when you are done with the snake, know that the world is still filled with his kind." And with that, Koa was gone, vanishing back into the wilderness as silently as he had arrived. The violent encounter left them breathless, but with a new, terrifying clarity. Their vague plan to head south was now obsolete. Koa had given them a target, a time, a place. It was a suicide mission, a direct confrontation against a band of seasoned killers. But it was also their only chance. They would no longer be hunting a ghost. They would be setting a trap. That night, they made their final preparations under the cold light of the moon. They packed what little they had: dried meat, ammunition, and Jacob's father's journal, now their sacred text. Before they left, Jacob walked to the small, unmarked patch of earth behind the barn where Abigail was buried. He stood there for a long time, then simply said, "I'm going to make it right." Sevens. At first light, they rode out. Jacob looked back one last time at the ranch, the place that had been his prison for 6 long years. It was just a collection of wood and dust now, its ghosts finally released. Beside him, Naiya sat tall on Pilgrim, her face set towards the east, towards Shadow Canyon. They were 2 small figures against a vast, hostile landscape, silhouetted against the rising sun. They were not running anymore. They were riding into the heart of the fire. Part 5. Where Vultures Gather. Shadow Canyon was a scar carved into the earth, a narrow, winding passage with sheer rock walls that clawed at the sky. It was a natural choke point, a place where travelers felt the unnerving sensation of being watched. For 2 days, Jacob and Naiya had moved like ghosts through the high country, finally reaching the canyon's rim as the sun began its slow descent. Here, they became architects of an ambush. Their partnership, forged in the quiet cabin, now found its rhythm in the grim calculus of battle. Jacob, drawing on a soldier's latent instincts he thought he'd buried long ago, mapped out the field of fire. He chose a rocky ledge overlooking a sharp bend in the trail, a perfect sniper's nest that offered both a clear view and a quick retreat. "They'll be focused on the wagon here," he explained, his voice low and tense. "That's when we hit them." While Jacob prepared their firing positions, Naiya moved through the landscape with a silent, innate understanding that he lacked. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a hunter on her own land. She identified a loose scree slope above the trail and, with painstaking effort, quietly dislodged several large boulders, leaving them balanced precariously, ready to be sent crashing down with a single, well-aimed push. She fashioned tripwires from vine and scattered dry branches in key locations to amplify the sounds of any approaching riders. They worked with few words, a seamless unit bound by a singular, bloody purpose. As twilight bled across the sky, casting the canyon in deep purples and bruised oranges, they settled into their positions. The waiting began, a silence stretched so taut it felt like a physical presence, heavy with the ghosts of Abigail and the people of the summer flame. The rumble of the transport wagon arrived first, its heavy wheels groaning under the weight of the silver payroll. Two tired-looking guards sat up front, rifles across their laps, their faces etched with the anxiety of men who knew they were carrying a death warrant through hostile territory. They passed the bend and continued down the trail, the bait taking its place in the trap. 10 minutes later, the vultures descended. 6 riders, appearing suddenly from the rocks like specters, their movements economical and predatory. They were led by a large, bearded man with a brutish face and the dead eyes of a killer, Calloway. The attack was swift and merciless. The guards barely had time to raise their rifles before they were cut down in a hail of gunfire. Calloway's men swarmed the wagon, their laughter echoing unnervingly off the canyon walls as they prepared to claim their prize. That was the moment Jacob and Naiya chose. From his perch, Jacob's rifle cracked, the sound a sharp, clean rebuttal to the raiders' laughter. One of the men by the wagon chest crumpled to the ground, a look of surprise frozen on his face. Before the others could react, a low rumble began from above. Naiya, straining with all her might, sent the boulders tumbling. They crashed down onto the trail with the force of a cannonade, a river of rock and dust that completely blocked the path and sent the raiders' horses into a panicked frenzy. 2 of the men were caught in the rock slide's edge, one crushed instantly, the other thrown from his horse. Chaos erupted. Jacob fired again, his second shot taking another raider out of the saddle. 3 left. But they were seasoned killers, not simple bandits. Recovering from the initial shock, they took cover and returned fire, the canyon now a roaring cauldron of ricocheting bullets and angry shouts. Calloway, a massive figure of rage, bellowed orders, directing his men's fire towards Jacob's position, pinning him down behind the rocks. Splinters of lead and stone showered Jacob's hiding place. He was trapped. Just as one of the raiders broke from cover, preparing to flank him, another shot rang out, this one from a different direction entirely, deeper within the canyon. The flanking raider dropped, a clean hole in his chest. Jacob peered through the smoke and fading light and saw him. Jedediah Jed Stone, positioned behind a cluster of boulders down trail, his long rifle smoking. The old bounty hunter hadn't been tracking them. He'd been tracking the silver, knowing it would draw Rourke's men out. The hunt had converged. The fight became a brutal, 3-way dance of death. Rourke's men were now caught between 2 fires. Jed, the consummate professional, fired with deadly, methodical precision, not as an ally, but as a craftsman thinning a herd. This chaotic battlefield was his workshop. Seizing the opportunity, Jacob broke from cover and charged down a narrow path to confront the leader. He met Calloway behind the wagon, and the fight devolved into a savage, close-quarters struggle. Jacob was wiry and fast, but Calloway was a bear of a man, fueled by raw, brutish strength. They exchanged blows, a desperate battle of knife and fists. "Where is he? Calloway?" Jacob roared over the din of gunfire, driving his knee into the man's gut. "Where's Rourke?" Sevens/Calloway, staggering back, let out a bloody, gurgling laugh. "Rourke?" He spat, blood flecking his beard. "You're fighting yesterday's war, friend." He lunged, a massive Bowie knife flashing in his hand. As they grappled, a shadow moved on the rocks above. Another of Calloway's men had circled around and now had a clear shot at Jacob's back. Before he could fire, an arrow, silent and swift, materialized in his throat. He choked, dropping his rifle, and tumbled from the rocks. Naiya stood on the opposite ridge, another arrow already knocked in the bow she had fashioned, her face a mask of cold, lethal focus. She had saved him. The distraction was all Jacob needed. He twisted out of Calloway's grip and slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's temple. Calloway dropped to his knees, dazed. Jacob pressed the barrel of the gun under his chin. "I won't ask again. Where is Gideon Rourke?" The man's bravado was gone, replaced by the fear of death. "Fort Redemption," he gasped. "The old Spanish fort, west of the river. He's there. Calls himself a king now." Those were his last words. The canyon fell silent, the echoes of the last gunshot fading into the twilight. It was over. The ground was littered with the dead. Jed Stone emerged from the rocks, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He walked over, his eyes taking in the carnage with a professional, almost bored, appraisal. He nudged Calloway's body with his boot. "That's one." He glanced at the other dead raiders. "That's two. Three." He looked at Jacob and Naiya, who now stood together. A tense silence hung between the three of them. "You folks had a busy afternoon," Jed said, his voice dry. "You saved my skin," Jacob admitted, his voice hoarse. Jed shrugged, beginning the grim task of collecting his proof of kill. "Don't mention it. You were shooting at my payday. We're even." Sons. The immediate objective had been won. They had survived. They had crippled Rourke's crew. But the true prize was the information, paid for in blood. They knew where the devil made his home. Jacob looked at Naiya, their faces illuminated by the rising moon, both smeared with gunpowder and dirt. They stood amidst the carnage, the first battle in their war finally over. The victory tasted of ash and gunpowder, a bitter confirmation of the path they had chosen. The real war, the one for the man in Fort Redemption, had just begun. Part 6. The Weight of the River. The journey to Fort Redemption was a pilgrimage through a wounded land. The frantic urgency that had propelled them to Shadow Canyon was replaced by a grim, methodical resolve. They were no longer two separate souls bound by tragedy, but a single entity, moving with a shared purpose. They rode in silence for long stretches, the landscape around them a reflection of their inner worlds, harsh, beautiful, and scarred. In the quiet moments around the campfire at night, a new intimacy bloomed. He would clean and oil his rifle while she stitched a tear in his shirt, her movements deft and sure. He learned the cadence of her breathing as she slept. She learned the meaning of the different shadows that passed through his eyes. They spoke of the future for the first time, not as a certainty, but as a possibility, a fragile seed they were protecting. It was a future that could only be planted after they had salted the earth of their past. The wounds they'd sustained in the canyon began to heal, leaving behind scars that told the story of their first battle together. They were ready for the last one. Fort Redemption was a skeleton bleaching in the sun. The old Spanish adobe fortress was a crumbling monument to a forgotten empire, now reanimated as a den for Gideon Rourke's murder of crows. It squatted on a low mesa, commanding a panoramic view of the desolate plains, a squalid kingdom of dust and decay. There would be no frontal assault. They were not an army. They were ghosts, and they would enter his home as such. They spent a full day observing from the surrounding hills, watching the lazy, arrogant movements of Rourke's dozen or so remaining men. It was Naiya who found the way in. Her eyes, accustomed to reading the subtle language of the earth, noticed what the fort's occupants had ignored. A partially collapsed section of an old aqueduct that ran from the river to the fort's cistern, a stone artery leading directly into the heart of the beast. That night, under the sliver of a cold moon, they made their move. They moved through the darkness like water, their footsteps whispering on the sand. The infiltration was a tense, silent ballet, a testament to the trust they now placed in each other's skills. They slipped through the broken aqueduct and into the belly of the fort, the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed men, and stale violence thick in the air. They found Rourke in the fort's cantina, a grand, high-ceilinged room now defiled with stolen finery and flickering tallow candles. He was older than Jacob had imagined, his face bloated from drink, but his eyes were still the same, the cold, empty eyes of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. He sat at a heavy table, a bottle in one hand, a pistol in the other, presiding over a handful of his men. The final confrontation began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Jacob stepped from the shadows. "Gideon Rourke," he said, his voice calm, carrying across the cavernous room. Rourke's men scrambled for their weapons, but it was too late. From a darkened balcony above, Naiya's rifle cracked, and one of the men dropped. The room exploded into chaos. Jacob fired, his pistol bucking in his hand, his movements precise and deadly. The gunfight was short and brutal, a close-quarters maelstrom of sound and fury. When the smoke cleared, only Rourke and Jacob were left standing, Naiya covering them both from above. Rourke stared at Jacob, his mind struggling to place the face. "Do I know you?" He sneered. "You might not remember a rancher named Thorne," Jacob said, stepping closer. "Or a girl named Abigail." Rourke's face was a blank. He had burned so many worlds he couldn't recall their names. Then Naiya stepped into the moonlight filtering down from the balcony. "But you remember the people of the summer flame," she said, her voice like ice. Recognition, and then amusement, flickered in Rourke's eyes. So, the little mouse survived. He chuckled, a sound like grinding stone. "Came all this way for revenge? The world is a hard place. You take what you want, or you die." He lunged, not with a gun, but with a hidden knife, a last, desperate act of a cornered snake. The fight was ugly and personal. Rourke was strong, but years of drink had made him slow. Jacob met his charge, the two men crashing to the floor. They grappled, rolled, each fighting for their past and their future. Rourke managed to slash Jacob's arm, a deep gash that burned like fire. But as he raised the knife for a killing blow, Naiya fired again. The shot was perfect, shattering the bone in Rourke's shoulder and sending the knife clattering away. He howled in pain, collapsing to the floor, disarmed and broken. Jacob rose, his pistol aimed at the pathetic, bleeding man who had haunted his every waking moment. The moment was here, the end of the road. "Go on," Rourke spat, his face a mask of hate. "Do it. Be the animal they say you are. Avenge your precious little sister." Jacob looked down at the man, the source of all his pain. He saw not a demon, but a pathetic, broken man. He thought of the cycle of violence, of blood paying for blood. He looked up at Naiya, and she gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head. This was not their way. But it had to end. With a heavy, solemn finality, Jacob squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was not a cheer of victory, but a full stop at the end of a dark and bloody chapter. Months later, a different sun shone on a different world. Far to the south, where the desert gave way to green river valleys, a small, sturdy cabin stood near the bend of a wide, flowing river. It was a humble home, but unlike Jacob's old ranch, it was whole. The sound of a hammer echoed in the clean air. Jacob, his arm now bearing a long, pale scar, was mending a chair on the porch. He was thinner, weathered, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. Naiya emerged from the cabin, her body full with the promise of new life. She carried a bowl of water to him, and he stopped his work to wash his hands, their fingers brushing in a simple, loving gesture. The silence that fell between them was not the tense, watchful silence of their first days, but a comfortable, easy quiet, full of unspoken understanding. Later, as evening painted the sky in soft pastels, they walked down to the river's edge. The water moved slow and certain, carrying the last of the day's light towards the horizon. She stepped barefoot into the shallows and took his hand, placing it gently on her belly. "The river is good here," she whispered, her voice full. "It washes away the dust. It only flows forward." Jacob looked at the water, then at her, at the new life they had created out of the ashes of their old ones. He thought of the long road they had traveled, of the 2 graves they had almost become. He felt the weight of the river, the weight of their past, and for the first time felt it settle not as a burden, but as an anchor in a new, peaceful harbor. And as he pulled her close, a genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips, a sight more beautiful than any sunset. The camera pulls back, leaving them there, 2 small figures in a vast, quiet land, their future flowing as peacefully and as surely as the river before them. And so the story of Jacob Thorne and Naiya of the Summer Flame finds its end, not in the roar of a final gunshot, but in the quiet, steady murmur of a river flowing towards a new dawn. Theirs was a journey that began in the shadow of a hanging tree and concluded on the banks of a peaceful shore, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding power of hope in a land that offered little of it. They rode into the heart of their shared nightmare, confronting the ghost that had authored their pain, not merely to satisfy a thirst for vengeance, but to reclaim the right to a future. The justice they delivered at Fort Redemption was not a triumphant celebration of violence, but a solemn and heavy act of closure, the final turning of a dark page in their history. In the end, they learned the ultimate truth of the frontier. The greatest wilderness is not the one made of rock and sand, but the one that lies within the human heart, and the bravest act of a survivor is not to fight, but to build. By choosing to lay down their arms and pick up the tools of a new life, they proved that love is not about finding a person who erases your scars, but one who gives you the strength to bear them. Their quiet peace, earned with blood and courage, stands as a powerful reminder that the past does not have to be a prison, and that even after the most brutal of fires, new life can, and will, find a way to grow.